The blizzard howled through the Montana wilderness like a living thing, driving sheets of snow against Ethan Harrison's cabin windows. He stoked the fireplace, grateful for its warmth, when a flash of movement caught his eye through the frost-painted glass. Something was out there in the storm. As a wildlife veterinarian, Ethan had learned to trust his instincts. 10 years of treating injured animals in the remote Bitterroot Mountains had taught him that the difference between life and death often came down to timing. He grabbed his emergency medical kit and heavy coat, clicking on his powerful flashlight before stepping into the tempest. The beam cut through the whiteout conditions, revealing tracks in the fresh snow, deer prints, but something about them seemed off. They were spaced irregularly, suggesting injury, and had an unusual crystalline quality that made them shimmer in his flashlight beam. Ethan followed the trail, wind whipping at his face as he pressed forward into the woods. 50 yards in, he found her. A doe lay curled beneath a snow-laden pine, her coat an impossible shade of silver-white that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Dark liquid that looked more like starlight than blood seeped from a wound in her flank. As Ethan approached, she raised her head, and he froze. Her eyes were unlike anything he'd ever seen, deep violet pools that held an intelligence far beyond any normal deer. "Easy there," he murmured, moving slowly closer. "I'm here to help." The doe watched him, showing none of the panic he'd expect from a wild animal. Instead, she seemed to study him, her gaze unervingly focused. The wound looked like it had been caused by a falling tree branch, but something wasn't right. The edges of the injury appeared to crystallize in the cold, forming delicate patterns like frost on a window pane. Ethan pushed aside his questions. Right now, the priority was getting her somewhere warm and stable. "This is going to be tricky," he told her, preparing a mild sedative. To his amazement, she didn't struggle when he approached with the needle. The moment the sedative entered her system, the air around them seemed to vibrate with a subtle hum, and for a split second, Ethan could have sworn he saw symbols of light dance across her fur. Using an emergency transport sled he kept for larger animals, Ethan carefully moved the doe back to his cabin. The storm intensified around them, but the wind seemed to part in their path, as if nature itself was helping guide them home. The doe's weight felt strangely light on the sled, almost as if she was partially floating. Inside his treatment room, Ethan worked methodically to clean and assess the wound. His medical instruments responded oddly, the thermometer displayed impossible readings, and his heart rate monitor picked up what seemed like multiple rhythms layered in complex patterns. The doe's blood, when he collected a sample, contained structures he'd never seen before, crystalline formations that caught the light like tiny prisms. As he worked late into the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a simple rescue. The doe's presence seemed to change the very air in the cabin. His old analog clock ran backwards for several minutes, then corrected itself. The northern lights appeared despite the storm clouds, dancing in impossible colors across his skylight. The doe's healing process defied everything Ethan knew about veterinary medicine. Within hours, the wound began closing itself, new tissue forming in geometric patterns. She watched him constantly, those violet eyes following his every move with an awareness that made him shiver. Just before dawn, exhausted but unwilling to leave his patient, Ethan pulled up a chair beside her. "What are you?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. The doe blinked slowly, and in the reflection of her eyes, Ethan caught a glimpse of something vast and beautiful, star systems swirling in ancient dances, worlds he'd never imagined existing. He must have dozed off because he awoke to find the first rays of sunrise streaming through his window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The doe slept peacefully, her wound now just a faint pattern of silver lines on her flank. As Ethan checked her vitals one more time, his hand brushed against her fur, and a jolt of electricity passed between them, not painful, but alive with possibility. Something extraordinary had found its way to his doorstep, and Ethan knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that this snowy night was just the beginning of a story that would stretch far beyond the confines of his quiet mountain life, reaching into the very stars themselves. Outside, the fresh snow sparkled with an otherworldly gleam, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, not in hunger or aggression, but in recognition of something ancient and powerful entering its domain. Ethan stood at his window, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold, while behind him, the mysterious doe dreamed dreams of distant galaxies. Over the next 3 days, the peculiar events around Ethan's cabin only intensified. The doe's recovery defied every natural law he'd ever studied, her wound now completely healed save for a pattern that resembled a constellation etched in silver across her flank. But it was the other occurrences that truly tested his grip on reality. His electronics behaved erratically whenever the doe was near. Lights flickered in rhythmic patterns, and his satellite phone picked up what sounded like distant songs in an impossible language. The plants in his indoor herb garden, which he kept for medicinal purposes, grew at extraordinary rates, sprouting leaves that spiraled in perfect mathematical sequences. On the evening of the 3rd day, Ethan sat at his desk reviewing his notes, trying to make sense of his observations. The doe rested comfortably on a bed of blankets nearby, having shown no interest in returning to the wild. Outside his window, the aurora borealis had appeared again, painting the sky in colors he'd never seen before, deep purples and shifting greens that seemed to pulse in time with the doe's breathing. "You're changing everything around you," he said softly, watching as his coffee mug vibrated slightly on his desk, the liquid inside forming perfect geometric ripples. "The question is, why here? Why now?" As if in response to his words, the doe stood gracefully and approached his desk. Her hooves made no sound on the wooden floor, and the air around her shimmed like heat waves on a summer road. When she reached him, she pressed her muzzle gently against his hand, and Ethan's world exploded into visions. He saw vast ships sailing through star-filled spaces, their designs both organic and geometric, impossibly beautiful. He glimpsed worlds with purple skies and floating cities, where beings of light and matter danced between forms as easily as humans changed clothes. In an instant, he understood that he was seeing memories, not dreams. The contact lasted only seconds, but when it broke, Ethan found himself breathless, gripping his desk for support. The doe, no, the being that wore a doe's shape, gazed at him with those violet eyes, and he saw intelligence, worry, and something like hope in their depths. That night, the transformation began. It started with light, soft at first, like moonlight filtering through clouds, emanating from the doe's form. The light grew stronger, taking on that same geometric quality he'd noticed in her wound's healing pattern. The air in the cabin became charged with energy, making Ethan's skin tingle and his hair stand on end. He watched, transfixed, as the doe's form began to shift. The process was beautiful rather than frightening, her body seeming to dissolve into points of light that rearranged themselves like stars finding new constellations. The light built to a crescendo that forced Ethan to shield his eyes. When he could look again, his breath caught in his throat. Where the doe had stood, a woman now stood, tall and ethereally beautiful. Her skin had a silvery sheen, and her hair floated around her head like starlit water. The constellation-like marking from her doe form now traced down her left arm in luminescent lines. She wore what seemed to be a bodysuit made of material that shifted colors like the aurora above. "Thank you, Ethan Harrison," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows hum. "You saved my life, and in doing so, you've proven yourself worthy of first contact." Ethan stood slowly, his veterinarian's calm warring with his absolute amazement. "You're not from Earth," he managed to say, immediately feeling foolish for stating the obvious. A smile touched her lips, sending ripples of light across her features. "My name is Lyra," she said, the name carrying undertones that suggested it was a translation of something far more complex. "I am a scout from what you would call the Celestial Concordat. My ship was damaged passing through your asteroid belt, and I was forced to adopt a native form to survive atmospheric entry. As she spoke, small objects around the room began to float, affected by whatever energy fields surrounded her. Outside, the aurora intensified, and Ethan could hear his wind chimes playing a melody that shouldn't have been possible given the still air. "There is much to explain," Lyra continued, moving with impossible grace to stand by the window. "And very little time. Those who monitor your skies will have detected the energy signature of my transformation. They will come looking." Ethan joined her at the window, watching as the night sky seemed to shift and dance above them. "Why show yourself to me now? Why trust me with this?" Lyra turned those violet eyes on him, and he saw in them the same intelligence that had captivated him in her doe form. "Because, Ethan Harrison, in all our observations of Earth, few humans have shown the pure compassion you demonstrated that night in the storm. You helped without question, without reward, and at risk to yourself." She paused, and the air between them seemed to crystallize with possibility. "And because I believe you can help me prevent a terrible misunderstanding between our peoples." Before Ethan could respond, his satellite phone shrieked to life with impossible static, and far in the distance, he could see lights moving up the mountain road, lights that spoke of authority and investigation rather than casual travel. Lyra's expression turned urgent. "We must go. Now. Will you help me again, Ethan Harrison?" The moment stretched between them like a thread of starlight, and Ethan knew his answer would change not just his life, but potentially the course of human history. Looking into those otherworldly eyes, he made his choice. The mountain forests passed in a blur as Ethan's truck navigated the back roads he normally used for reaching injured wildlife. Beside him, Lyra's presence made the vehicle's electronics fluctuate wildly, the radio cycling through frequencies, catching fragments of transmissions that couldn't possibly be reaching this remote location. "They're tracking the energy signature I produce," Lyra explained, her voice carrying those strange harmonics that made Ethan's bones resonate. "Every living thing has a unique energy pattern, but mine is, distinctly non-terrestrial." As if to demonstrate, she lifted her hand, and threads of light danced between her fingers like auroral strands. The pursuing vehicles had split up, their searchlights sweeping the forest in coordinated patterns. Ethan guided his truck deeper into the wilderness, taking routes only locals would know. "You mentioned preventing a misunderstanding between our peoples," he said, keeping his eyes on the treacherous road. "What did you mean?" Lyra's expression shifted, sending ripples of light across her silvery skin. "My people, the Celestial Concordat, have been observing Earth for centuries. We've watched your species evolve technologically, culturally, spiritually. We've debated endlessly about when, or if, to make contact." She paused, and the air in the truck grew heavy with unspoken significance. "There are those among us who believe humanity isn't ready, that your species is too volatile, too prone to violence." A helicopter thundered overhead, its searchlight cutting through the canopy. Ethan turned off his headlights and guided the truck into a hidden grove he used for wildlife observation. The darkness wrapped around them like a protective cloak, broken only by the subtle glow emanating from Lyra's form. "But you think differently?" Ethan asked, killing the engine. "I believe in humanity's potential," Lyra said, turning those vast violet eyes toward him. "Your capacity for compassion, for innovation, for overcoming your own limitations, it's remarkable. The night you found me, you proved what I've always argued, that humanity's heart is greater than its fears." The sound of vehicles passing on the main road echoed through the trees. Lyra continued, her voice softening. "But now my presence here, my forced landing and transformation, has accelerated everything. The faction that fears humanity will use this incident to argue for continued isolation, perhaps even active avoidance of your species." Ethan absorbed this, watching how the moonlight seemed to bend around her, creating patterns that hurt his eyes if he looked too long. "And the government vehicles pursuing us? How do they fit into this?" "They represent both the problem and the opportunity," Lyra said, raising her hand to create a holographic display in the air between them. It showed various locations around the globe, pulsing with different colors. Earth's governments have detected our presence multiple times, but without context, without understanding. They react from a place of fear, assuming the worst. If they capture me, if their first official contact with my species is through force and fear. She let the thought hang in the air. A branch cracked nearby, too close. Lyra's form flickered, almost transparently, and Ethan realized she was fighting the instinct to shift forms again. The energy it took was making the air itself vibrate. "You're weakening," he observed, concern overriding his awe. "The transformation, the energy you're expending to maintain this form." "Yes," she admitted. "Without my ship's stabilizing field, maintaining any single form is challenging." Her outline blurred slightly, starlight bleeding into the air around her. "I need to reach the emergency beacon I ejected before crash landing. It contains both a way to contact my people and the technology to help me stabilize." More vehicles were approaching, and this time Ethan could make out the distinctive black SUVs of government agencies through the trees. "Where is it?" Lyra's holographic display zoomed in on a location high in the mountains. "There. But it's not just about reaching it anymore, Ethan. I need to convince my people that humanity is ready for contact. And for that." She turned to him, her form solidifying with visible effort. "I need your help to demonstrate the very compassion and wisdom that made you save a strange deer in a snowstorm." The searchlights were getting closer, their beams methodically sweeping the forest. Ethan looked at Lyra, this being who had trusted him with a truth bigger than anything humanity had ever faced, and made his decision. He reached into the back of his truck and pulled out his wilderness survival pack. "The beacons in the high country?" he asked, already planning routes in his head. "There's an old trail system up there, used by wildlife researchers. Barely maintained, probably not on any official maps. We can." He stopped as Lyra's hand touched his arm, sending a shock of sensation through him that felt like touching the northern lights themselves. Her eyes held his, and in them he saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, something that made his heart race. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why risk everything to help me again?" Ethan thought about the nights spent tending to injured animals, about the belief that all life was connected, about the wonder he'd felt seeing those violet eyes for the first time. "Because," he said finally, "if we let fear stop us from helping others, human, animal, or alien, then we lose the very thing that makes us worthy of the stars in the first place." Lyra's form brightened with emotion, and for a moment, the forest around them lit up as if dawn had come early. In that light, Ethan saw her true smile for the first time, an expression of pure joy that seemed to reach into his very soul. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps and radio chatter. Without another word, they gathered what they needed and slipped into the darkness of the forest. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, watching as two beings from different worlds began a journey that would change both their civilizations forever. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold as Ethan and Lyra made their way through the rugged terrain. The high-altitude air was thin, but Ethan's years of tracking injured wildlife through these mountains had prepared him well. Lyra moved beside him with otherworldly grace, though he could see the strain of maintaining her humanoid form in the subtle flickers of light that occasionally rippled across her skin. "The beacon is emitting a frequency that only our technology can detect," Lyra explained as they paused to rest beneath a towering pine. "But the energy signature I produce while trying to maintain this form." She gestured to the shimmer around her, "It's like a beacon itself." In the valley below, they could see the government vehicles regrouping, their movements suggesting a methodical search pattern. Helicopters circled wider areas, equipped with what Ethan assumed were energy detection devices. "They're not just looking with standard equipment," Lyra confirmed, following his gaze. "Some of your agencies have recovered fragments of our technology over the years. Not enough to understand it, but enough to detect its presence." A distant rumble made them both look up. Through breaks in the clouds, Ethan caught glimpses of what appeared to be military aircraft moving into the area. The situation was escalating. "We need to move," he said, shouldering his pack. "There's a system of caves ahead. The mineral content in the rocks might help mask your energy signature." He'd used the caves before to treat injured animals during storms, though he never imagined he'd be using them to hide an alien fugitive. As they moved, Lyra suddenly stumbled, her form flickering more violently than before. Ethan caught her before she could fall, and the contact sent waves of sensation through his body, like touching electricity and starlight combined. For a moment, their minds connected again, and he caught fragments of her thoughts: concern for her mission, fear of failure, and something warmer, softer when she thought of him. "The atmosphere here," she gasped, regaining her balance but not pulling away from him. "It's more challenging than I calculated. The molecular composition affects the stability of my transformation matrix." Her voice carried new harmonics, like multiple tones weaving together. They reached the caves just as the sound of helicopters grew closer. Inside, the temperature dropped significantly, and their breath fogged in the dim light. Ethan led them deeper, using his knowledge of the cave system to find a secure location. "What happens if you can't maintain this form?" he asked, setting up an emergency light. The question had been nagging at him, watching her increasing struggle. Lyra's expression shifted, sending cascades of light across her features. "Without the beacon's stabilizing field, would revert to my natural state. But in Earth's atmosphere, without protection." She left the implications hanging. "It would kill you," Ethan finished quietly, understanding dawning. She nodded, and suddenly her desperate need to reach the beacon made even more sense. A noise from the cave entrance made them both freeze. Voices echoed off the stone walls: search teams had found the cave system. Lyra's form flickered again, more violently this time, and Ethan made a quick decision. "There's another way out," he whispered, taking her hand. "Through a tight passage that connects to the other side of the mountain. I found it tracking an injured wolf last spring." He didn't mention how dangerous the passage was, or that he'd barely fit through it himself. They moved deeper into the cave system, the voices growing fainter behind them. The passage Ethan remembered was tight, almost too tight. As they approached it, Lyra stopped, her light illuminating the narrow opening. "Ethan," she said softly, his name carrying harmonics that made his heart skip. "If we get separated, if something happens." She placed her hand on his chest, and suddenly his mind was flooded with information: coordinates, frequencies, complex mathematical formulas. "This is everything my people need to know about how you helped me. About why humanity deserves a chance." The contact was overwhelming, filling his mind with star maps and alien knowledge. When it broke, he found himself gasping, steadying himself against the cave wall. Lyra watched him with those impossible violet eyes, concern evident in their depths. "Why show me this now?" he asked, still processing the vast amount of information now stored in his memory. "Because what we're about to do is dangerous, and..." She paused, her form brightening with emotion. "Because you've shown me that the connection between beings can transcend the boundaries of worlds and species. What you did for me, first as a deer and now, it proves everything I believed about humanity's potential." The voices were getting closer again. Lyra's light dimmed suddenly, her form becoming almost transparent for a moment before solidifying. She was running out of time. Ethan reached out, his hand passing through the shimmer of energy that surrounded her to touch her face. The contact sent sparks of sensation through them both, and in that moment, the alien and the human connected in a way that defied the vast distances between their origins. "We'll make it," he promised, both to her and to himself. "And when we do, I'll help you show both our peoples that fear doesn't have to define our first steps toward each other." Behind them, flashlight beams began to illuminate the cave walls. Above, the rumble of aircraft grew louder. And ahead, the narrow passage waited, their only chance to reach the beacon that could save not only Lyra's life, but perhaps the future of human-alien relations. In the darkness of the cave, Lyra's light pulsed once, bright and determined, before they began their desperate journey through the mountain's heart. The passage through the mountain was a blur of tight spaces and racing hearts. By the time they emerged on the other side, the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. Lyra's form was now fluctuating constantly, her outline bleeding starlight into the growing darkness. "The beacon," she gasped, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air vibrate. "It's close. I can feel it." She pointed toward a rocky outcropping above them, her arm temporarily becoming translucent before solidifying again. Ethan helped her climb, supporting her increasingly unstable form. Each touch sent cascades of sensation through him, like holding onto the aurora itself. The government forces would figure out their escape route soon, and the helicopters were still circling, their searchlights cutting through the gathering dusk. They reached the outcropping just as Lyra's transformation began to fail completely. Her humanoid form rippled and shifted, patches of her body becoming transparent, showing glimpses of something beneath that Ethan's mind couldn't quite process, geometries that seemed to fold through dimensions he couldn't perceive. "There." Her voice was layered with impossible frequencies as she pointed to a small crater in the rocks. Within it lay a crystalline object about the size of a football, its surface etched with patterns similar to the ones that had marked her dear form. The moment Lyra touched the beacon, it came alive with light. Symbols and patterns danced across its surface, and the air around them began to hum with energy. Lyra's form stabilized somewhat, though she remained partially transparent. "It's sending the signal," she said, relief evident in her multi-toned voice. "My people will come." She looked at Ethan, her violet eyes now containing swirling galaxies. "But the government forces will detect this energy signature. They're coming too." As if on cue, they heard vehicles approaching on the mountain roads below, and multiple helicopters began converging on their position. Searchlights swept closer to their location. "How long?" Ethan asked, already looking for defensive positions. "Minutes. My people were waiting for this signal." Lyra's form flickered again. "But Ethan, when they come, you'll have to make a choice." Before he could ask what she meant, the first helicopter spotted them. Its searchlight pinned them in place as voices over loudspeakers ordered them to surrender. More helicopters approached, and the sound of vehicles and running feet echoed up the mountainside. Lyra's beacon pulsed faster, its light growing stronger. Above them, the stars began to shift, patterns changing as something massive moved through Earth's upper atmosphere. The air grew thick with energy, making Ethan's skin tingle and his hair stand on end. The government forces reached their position, surrounding them in a circle of drawn weapons and bright lights. But before anyone could speak or act, the sky opened. There was no other way to describe it. The space above them seemed to fold, revealing a ship that defied human engineering. It was organic and geometric at once, its surface flowing like liquid starlight. Its arrival sent waves of energy cascading over the mountain, disrupting electronics and causing the helicopters to pull back hastily. In that moment of chaos, Lyra's form finally destabilized completely. But instead of dissolving, she transformed into her true self. Ethan found himself standing next to a being of pure light and energy, her form suggesting both flowing water and crystalline structure, with patterns of constellation-like markings swimming through her translucent body. She was simultaneously the most alien and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The government forces fell back in shock, weapons lowered in the face of something that challenged their entire understanding of reality. Above, the ship began to descend, creating a cylinder of energy that reached toward them. "Ethan," Lyra's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, filled with harmonics that brought tears to his eyes. "My people will honor you for helping me. They'll offer you a place among the stars, a chance to be a bridge between our worlds." Her form reached out, energy sparking between them. "Come with me." The choice hit him like a physical force. Behind him, he could hear voices calling for order, for responses, for decisions to be made. Before him stretched the possibility of seeing wonders no human had ever witnessed. And beside him stood, or rather, existed, the being he had saved and come to care for in ways that transcended normal understanding. In that moment of decision, Ethan thought about all he had learned in his years of helping injured wildlife. About how the most important connections often came from the most unexpected encounters. About how fear and wonder were two sides of the same coin. He looked at the government forces, seeing not enemies but humans confronting the unknown. Then he looked at Lyra, seeing not an alien but a soul who had trusted him with her life and her truth. "I'll come with you," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "But not to leave Earth behind. To help build a bridge between our worlds. To show both sides that compassion and understanding can overcome fear." Lyra's form brightened with joy, her light pulsing in patterns that somehow conveyed both happiness and love. The cylinder of energy from the ship enveloped them both as more vehicles arrived and voices shouted orders. As they began to rise toward the ship, Ethan saw one of the government agents lower his weapon and step forward, face filled with wonder rather than fear. It was a small gesture, but in it lay the seed of hope, proof that humanity could choose understanding over fear. Above them, the ship waited to take them to a future neither of them could fully predict. Behind them, Earth spun on, forever changed by a chance encounter in a snowstorm. And between them flowed the kind of love that proved life, in all its forms, could find ways to connect across the vast distances of space and understanding. The stars welcomed them home.